Conference of the ERF. My name is Meltem Dayıoğlu. I'm a professor of economics at Middle East Technical University, and at the same time, I am a research fellow of the ERF. Today, we have two very interesting papers. Our parallel session is called Work Opportunities, Home and Away, and we have two speakers with us with two very interesting papers. The first paper is by Dr. Shireen Al-Azawi, and the name of her paper is Lives versus Livelihoods, Who Can Work from Home in MENA. And the second paper is by Reem Hassan, and the paper is entitled Between Hope and Despair, Egypt's Revolution and Migration Intentions. So the plan for today is to have 20-minute presentations, and then there will be a short discussion comments, and the discussant for this session is myself. And then we will open up the floor for your questions and comments and discussion. So let me start by introducing Dr. Shireen Al-Azawi to you, and she's going to be our first speaker. But I will introduce Reem Hassan as well, so that we can move more smoothly. So Dr. Shireen Al-Azawi is a lecturer in the economics department of Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University, and a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum. She's also a microeconomist at UNDP, a regional hub for Arab states. Dr. Shireen's research focuses on poverty and inequality, labor economics, international trade, with special emphasis on Middle East and North Africa. Shireen received her PhD in economics from the University of California at Davis. She has her master's degrees from Stanford University and the American University in Cairo. And before joining Santa Clara, Shireen was an assistant professor at the American University in Cairo. Reem Hassan holds a bachelor's degree in political science and economics and master's degree in economics with a focus on migration from the University of Munich. After graduation, Reem worked at the Info Center for International Institutional Comparisons and Migration Research as a research assistant on projects focused on the impact of refugees on the German labor market. Reem also worked at the Max Planck Research Institute as a scientific officer and oversaw data collection of the Survey on Migrants' Expectations in Germany. Currently, she works as a data consultant at Pandera in Berlin. So let me turn the floor to Dr. Shireen Al-Azawi to present her paper on Lives versus Livelihoods, Who Can Work from Home in MENA. So Shireen.
Hello, everyone. Hi, thank you very much, Meltem. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about this research. Let me share my screen. Okay, and I just want to mention that this paper is part of a larger study that I conducted for UNDP on the impact of COVID-19 on Arab labor markets, which should be coming out soon. Obviously, over the last year, the whole world has been turned upside down by the pandemic. We were forced into lockdowns and curfews, and people have had to shift to working from home in an effort to stem the spread of the virus. Obviously, this has had huge economic impacts, both on aggregate supply and aggregate demand, with severe impact on workers' ability to maintain their livelihoods. Many businesses have had to shut down or downsize in the face of declining demand. Some obviously will never be able to come back, but hopefully things are a bit more optimistic now, and we will see the end of this pandemic soon. The Middle East and North Africa obviously also faced another crisis due to the oil price shock, and this had an impact both on oil exporting countries directly, but also indirectly on oil importing countries that faced a potential huge reduction in remittances some of which has materialized, but it wasn't as stark as initially predicted. In this study, we investigate the supply side effects of these shocks on the labor market, looking at the jobs that could be potentially performed remotely and the characteristics of workers who are most likely to be in such jobs. Very briefly, the ILO came out with some estimates based on nowcasting models on how much of an impact on labor markets in the MENA region there's going to be. And obviously, the biggest impact was during the second quarter, when most of the severest, the strictest lockdowns were in place. Estimates revised early this year suggests that about 24% of working hours were lost in North African, Middle East countries, and another 20%, almost 19%, were lost in Arab states. Obviously, as the year went on, many countries abandoned the strict version of the lockdowns in an effort to reduce the economic impact. But still, the impact was quite large in the third and fourth quarters. And these estimates come out to substantial full-time equivalent jobs, loss in income, and loss in GDP. And so the impact has been huge. And the question is, who were the most impacted workers? Obviously, not everyone was affected in the same way. Some people have called this pandemic the great unequalizer. The inequalities that were already persisted in the economy just magnified and manifested themselves in probably the ugliest way possible. And so the question is, who was the most affected? Who was the most at risk? And in this study, I used data from 5 labor force and labor market panel surveys for 5 Arab countries, 5 Middle Eastern countries, representing 3 groups: oil exporting, middle income oil countries, as well as fragile and conflict economies. For each of the 5 countries, I used the most recent available data: Algeria Labor Force Survey 2014, Egypt Labor Market Panel Survey, Jordan Labor Market Panel Survey, and Tunisia Labor Market Panel Survey, ERF surveys, of course, and then the Palestine Labor Force Survey for 2019. The method by which we classify workers as being able to work from home or not follows a number of studies that came out right after the pandemic began that use surveys on daily activities of workers by occupation to determine whether a job can be potentially performed remotely. These surveys ask workers things like, how often do you carry heavy objects? How often do you operate heavy machinery, or do you get exposed to heat or extreme temperatures? These types of questions allow researchers to classify jobs as potentially remote friendly or not. The classification that I follow is the classification of Dingle and Neiman, who performed this study for the United States and then applied it for a number of other countries. And I, of course, had to do a concordance to match the classification, which is based on the US occupational classification, to the classifications used in the surveys for the MENA region. You can read the details in the paper. Different countries had different classification systems, and I had to perform this either at the 2 or 3 digit ISCO level. So jumping right away to the results and looking down here first at the countrywide results, I find that on average, a relatively small share of jobs can be performed remotely in these 5 Arab countries. It ranges from 17% of all jobs in Tunisia to a high of 29% in Jordan. Just to put this in perspective, for the United States, the share was 42%. So it's lower, and definitely we want to dig deeper into this to see how different groups, how different age groups or people in different occupations are going to be affected. So the range is quite low, and of course, this is just a potential. This is something to keep in mind. These are jobs that could be potentially performed from home. Doesn't actually mean that they will be in practice, because obviously working from home requires certain attributes that may not necessarily be present. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, one interesting difference comes between men and women. And of course, a well-known fact about Arab labor markets is that there's very low female labor force participation. And as a result of that, it's not surprising that in 3 of the countries under study, the share of women who can work from home in Palestine, in Jordan, and in Algeria is almost 3 times as high as the share of men. Basically, what this is saying is that the women who do work in these countries tend to work in jobs that could potentially, again, the key word here is potentially, be done from home. For Egypt and for Tunisia, the difference between men and women is still there, but it's not as big. We also looked at industry. So I looked at the 5 largest industries in each of these countries in terms of employment. And for all of the countries under study, and this is the reason why there is relatively low telework potential, the industries with the highest concentration of workers, such as construction, for example, in Algeria, or agriculture in Egypt, again, construction and wholesale or retail in Palestine, and so on. These are the industries that tend to have the largest share of workers, and they also have relatively low telework potential. And so this almost explains the result. And if we look at women again, if we look at women through this industry classification, I don't have the figures here to save on space. In the countries where women are more likely to have a remote friendly job, they tend to be concentrated in education, and that explains the very high telework potential for women in countries like Jordan, Algeria, and Palestine. I also looked at the age dimension as well as the formality dimension. And of course, as we expect, it's not surprising, youth are disadvantaged in terms of the jobs that can be performed from home. They have much lower telework potential than older cohorts. Of course, they are also a smaller percentage of the labor force in each country. That's expected, but still, they do have far lower telework potential. In terms of formality, and again, not surprising, informal jobs have far lower telework potential than formal jobs. Sometimes it's 1/4 or even 1/5 of the telework potential of the formal jobs. And finally, I combined the 2 together, the age and the formality status, and I looked at whether the formal job is a job for a young person or not, and youth here is defined as age 15 to 24. And obviously, for all the informal workers, it's pretty low. The potential to work from home is pretty low. It's even lower for youth in informal jobs. But for the formal jobs, and with the exception of Algeria, formal youth are also disadvantaged compared to formal non-youth. Bringing it all together and trying to estimate a logit model on the correlates of low teleworkability, I perform a simple logit estimation where the dependent variable takes the value 1 if the teleworkability index is below the mean for that country. So these are the low telework potential workers. What are the correlates of having a low teleworkability index? And of course, I look at age, gender, education, region of residence. And then for some countries, I have data on wealth. So I use that, whether they work in a micro enterprise, and then the industry and the formality status. And the results are expected based on the descriptive analysis. For all of the countries under study, the characteristics that make a worker more likely to have low teleworkability, to not be able to work from home, or being male, being a youth, a young person, having low educational attainment, so anything less than university degree, coming from a lower wealth quintile. So if you are rich, you are more likely to be able to work from home. And similarly, if you live in an urban area, you are more likely to be able to work from home. Being in a micro enterprise, agriculture and mining or manufacturing, and being in an informal job, all of these make it more likely that you have low telework potential. Now, as I said, this is just a potential. It doesn't actually mean that people will be able to work from home in practice. In the real world, people need at least some tools to be able to do that, such as a personal computer and a reliable internet connection, even continuous electric power, which doesn't actually exist in many of the regions of the Arab world. And obviously, there are many other distractions, especially for women in terms of household chores, childcare, homeschooling. And so all of these make it in practice a lot less likely that they will actually work from home. And I was able to use data from the Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia labor market panel surveys to look at just one aspect of this. And so again, this doesn't take into consideration everything else. If a worker has a computer and a home internet connection, in addition to this telework potential. So the first row in this table just repeats the teleworkability index that we had in the figures. And for the three countries combined, it's about 20% of jobs. If we look at the high telework potential individuals who actually also own a computer and internet, the share falls dramatically to just 1/4 of that, just 5%. And if we compare it to the median instead of the mean, it's a little bit higher, just 7%. And so for all of these countries, while this is a potential, these numbers at the top here, they don't necessarily mean that all these people were actually able to work from home. And I expect that if we included something like having a place free from distractions or childcare chores and homeschooling, the share would fall even more. Now, one last thing, and I think I have just a few minutes left, that I did, and I'll talk about this very quickly. The classification that I used is based on surveys of workers here in the United States. And of course, and I am in the United States, that doesn't necessarily mean that if a job can be performed from home in the US, it can also be performed from home in Egypt or Palestine or Tunisia. So there are some questions in the Egypt labor market panel survey that can help us get a similar sense of the jobs that can be potentially performed from home from a MENA perspective. And while these questions are helpful, they don't provide the same level of information as the questions in the studies by Dingle and Neiman and others such as Saltil, since they don't ask about the frequency of a particular activity. They just ask whether you perform an activity, like do you ever carry a heavy object? Are you exposed to extreme heat? They don't ask about the frequency. So that's something to keep in mind. But nevertheless, we could still use them. And the 18 questions are listed over here. And because of the fact that they don't give me a sense of the frequency, I calculated several different indices reflecting several different possibilities. First, the data has a question that asks whether you actually work from home right now. And there are about 3% of the workers in the data set that were already working from home. So I included those in all of the measures. And then I progressively added more questions to see how many people would be able to work from home once we include several other daily activities. And if we look at computer skills and having a computer at work, this raises the work from home potential to about 19%. If we add or we eliminate actually several other attributes that can make it difficult to work from home, like supervising others, requiring physical fitness, working in tourism, and so on. Once we eliminate a lot of these other activities or attributes, we get a higher share. One thing that has changed dramatically during the pandemic is dealing with the public. So many jobs that involved dealing with the public before, which would have required face-to-face interaction, switched successfully to remote work. Think of administrative jobs, service jobs in the public administration. A lot of these jobs were successfully done remotely in many parts of the world. So once we eliminate that, the share rises even more. Now, of course, not all jobs require a computer and computer skills. So thinking of craft jobs, for example, they can be done from home. They don't necessarily need a computer. And so if eliminating this question, the share obviously falls quite a bit. But again, once we relax some of the constraints, the share rises a bit more. Let me just finish very quickly by saying that I also applied this to the other countries in the study. And the number in this last column over here is the number based on the Dingle and Neiman classification. If I apply the Egypt classification, the numbers range between 26 and 35 for Jordan, 22 and 27% in Palestine, 18% and 21% in Tunisia. So to summarize very quickly, I know I'm out of time. I find that relatively few jobs can be performed from home. Workers who are older, well-educated, and in the formal sector are at a relative advantage. Those who are going to be having a harder time if we ever have to go into lockdowns again, are youth, informal workers, male workers, workers in rural areas, workers who work in micro enterprises, those with less than university education, in agriculture or mining, and those from lower wealth quintiles would have much lower telework potential. Now, while this might seem like quite pessimistic, in reality, I actually think it's the results are not as pessimistic as it might seem, since it doesn't really necessitate a huge structural change in the economy to allow more workers to work remotely. A lot of the jobs could be performed potentially at home, like 30% almost in Jordan, 23% in Egypt and Palestine and Algeria. It just requires some investment in the necessary tools, in the necessary resources in order for workers to actually be able to work from home. I had some policy recommendations, but you can read them in the paper. I'm going to stop right now to give time for my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shireen. It was an excellent presentation and paper, and you were really on time. So thank you very much. So let's move on to Reem, and then we'll have the discussion at the very end, if it's okay. So the paper is Between Hope and Despair, Egypt's Revolution and Migration Intentions.
Can you see the presentation well?
Yes, perfectly well.
Good. So hello, everyone. My name is Reem Hassan, and I'll be presenting my and Dr. Yvonne Giesing's paper, Between Hope and Despair, Egypt's Revolution and Migration Intentions. Actually. Okay, I'll have to move it up a bit like that. So in 2011, the Arab Spring happened in the Arab world, and in Egypt between 2011 and 2014, Egypt saw a period of insecurity and political instability. So in 2011, Egyptians protested across Egypt demanding for bread, freedom, and social justice. In 2012, Mohamed Morsi was elected president from the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2013, there were protests on the street for the resignation of Mohamed Morsi, and then in 2014, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi became president. So you can clearly see that we had 4 years of ongoing unrest, which leads us to our question: how did the Egyptian revolution of 2011 affect the international migration intentions of youth in Egypt? Literature on that topic has been mainly focused on political instability and violence and its relationship with migration. So political revolutions have not really been exploited in the literature. And the first stance is the effect of political instability or violence on the economic development on the country, and then in turn on migration through the economic channel. And then the second kind of stance in the literature is the microeconomic one, which states that exposure to conflict and violence affects behavior and preferences. So, for example, an experimental study by Vors et al. In rural Burundi found that people that were more exposed to violence actually showed more altruistic behavior towards their neighbor and became more risk-seeking. There was more research focusing on the effect of the Arab Spring, which you could classify as revolutions, as it did not only bring violence or instability, but also a lot of optimism and hope for the people that went on the street. So, for example, we see Asemoglu et al. In 2017 exploited the daily variation in the protest in Tahrir Square, the hub, so to speak, of the Egyptian revolution. They exploited the daily variation of the protest there to see how that affected the stock market, and they found that more intense protests are associated with lower stock market valuations, especially for firms that are connected to the group currently in power. We have other researches that have exploited the geographical variation in the protests. So seeing protests all across Egypt and how the intensity of the revolution was different in the geographical area, and conduct difference estimation based on that. So, for example, we have in Malach et al., who in 2018 conducted difference estimation and found that people that live in areas with high protests actually reduced their intra-household differences in labor force participation because the women's employment was increased. And we, for example, have a paper by Dr. Yvonne Giesing and Muzic in 2019, who also exploited the geographical variation of the revolution intensity and found that the revolution actually affected household behavior and their spending and saving patterns, that they increased their education spending, especially on their male sons, and especially in areas in favor of the regime change. And this again highlights this optimism channel and this hope channel that is usually brought by revolutions, or in that case in Egypt. Looking at the data that we use the survey of young people in Egypt. So it's a panel data set that was conducted once in 2009 and another time in 2014. And it mainly focuses on the young people. It only focuses on youth. So in 2009, the sample was aged between 10 and 29. And in 2014, 3 years later, only on individuals that are, so the same individuals that were then 13 and 32 years of age. The data is truly representative of Egypt because we have samples in living in urban areas, rural areas, and most importantly, slum areas that were a bit disregarded in the literature in Egypt, people living in informal areas. So in 2019, more than 15,000 people were surveyed. In 2014, 73 of the original sample were able to be asked again. which means that in our difference in difference estimation, we use this harmonized data set of 10,916 respondents. We combine the survey with the Wikithawra database, which is the statistical database of the Egyptian Revolution. There we have information on the deaths, injuries, and detainees during the protests between 2011 and 2014. And we have detailed information on each incident. We have the information on the name of the person, the age, address, profession, the cause of death or injury with the exact date and location and protest where this has happened. And combining these two data, we were able to develop the revolution intensity index, or the value of the revolution intensity. So this index has in the numerator the number of deaths in one location. And this is purely taken from the Wikithawra database. And then in the denominator, we have the quadratic distance from that location where the incident happened to the location where the survey respondent lives. And we, of course, to the power of 2 to put more weight on distances that are closer and less weight on distances that are very far away that would not really affect the person in through this direct link. You can see here a heat map of the index of the revolution intensity, and as expected, of course, the revolution intensity is highest in Greater Cairo and Alexandria. But you can see that most of the protests happen, if not all of the protests, of course, alongside the Nile. Moving on to our difference in difference analysis. So we disaggregate our sample into two groups. The control groups, which includes all individuals that have a revolution intensity that is lower than the median per governorate. And then we have the treatment group that has individuals with an above median revolution intensity per governorate. We have here our dependent variable is a binary variable with the migration intentions of the individual. So it takes a value of 0 when the respondent does not intend to migrate, and the value of 1 when they intend to migrate. And the question is very clearly formed: do you intend to migrate for working, living, or studying abroad? Our coefficient of interest is beta 3 here, as it measures the effect of the revolution post-treatment on the treatment group, meaning for the people that had a high intensity revolution, and in 2014, 3 years after the revolution. Moving on to the results, we can interestingly see that the revolution had a negative effect on the migration pattern of youth. So the total sample actually decreased their migration intentions by 4 percentage points in all of the total sample. Or let's put it differently, youth that lived in high intensity areas reduced their migration intentions by 4%. If we look at this sample by women and men, we can see that the male population is mainly driving the results with a coefficient of minus 0.06. So they decrease their migration intentions by more than 6 percentage points. This could have 2 reasons. So the first one is clearly cultural and socioeconomic factors when it comes to the gender gap in the Arab world or in Egypt. But secondly, previous research has found that women tend to be more risk averse, and risk aversion is positively correlated with migration, which could be a potential explanation here. But digging deeper and looking into more subsamples, we can actually see that the female population has significant coefficients, but only in the slump samples, and more to that in a few minutes. If we disaggregate the group into our sample into education groups, here we have in the first column individuals that have no formal education at all. In the second column, we have individuals that have less than high school education. And in the third column, we see the individuals that have at least a high school education or vocational. And in the fourth group, we have the individuals that have at least a high school degree or higher. And interestingly enough, the last group, the highly educated group, is not significantly affected by this insecurity channel, where we have in previous literature the assumption or the hypothesis that highly educated people are more likely to migrate. And here we can see that the insecurity channel did not really contribute to that. Looking at the results per residency area, we see the most interesting results, and that is the slum sample. People living in informal areas are the ones that are actually driving the results that we see. So people living in informal areas have decreased their migration intentions by more than 13 percentage points, significantly so, whereas people in urban and rural areas did not significantly change their migration intentions. And this could be due to the higher threshold of insecurity that people living in informal areas have. So informal areas tend to lack infrastructure, have less security, meaning they have less police precincts, for example, present in the areas where they live. All in all, less infrastructure and less security. And this could mean that their threshold of insecurity perception is higher than those living in urban and rural areas. And this is why they were mostly affected by the optimism channel, not the insecurity channel, and significantly so. And if we dig deeper into the slum sample, we can actually see that both women and men living in informal areas have changed their migration intentions due to the revolution. In Egypt, they both significantly decreased, their migration intentions. Of course, males higher so, but we can see that women living in informal areas also did decrease their migration intentions due to the revolution. And lastly, looking at the education groups here within the slum sample, we see the direction we expect for the highly educated group, and the highly educated group that have at least a high school degree, that have at least a university degree or higher, have decreased their migration intentions by more than 35 percentage points due to the revolution. And this could be due to the optimism channel that they, during the revolution, were more affected by the optimism channel, that they could actually pursue their careers in Egypt when the regime changes. Because to begin with, the highly educated group is the one that had a higher migration intentions before the revolution. So looking at the different channels that play a role in this effect, we looked at the insecurity channel, that we measured the effect of using the revolution intensity, using the difference in difference estimation, and we see that the coefficient is not as it is theoretically how it should be. We expected a positive correlation if we're just looking at the insecurity channel, a positive correlation between revolution intensity and migration because of the insecurity channel. However, this is not what the results show. The results are mainly driven by the optimism channel. The optimism channel is, however, tedious to measure, as it depends on the political identification of the person, especially during these 4 years in Egypt, where in 2011, the revolution meant one thing, in 2012 another, in 2013 another. So it's very hard to measure which group has more hope, has more optimism at which point. And unfortunately, the survey did not ask the respondents about their political identification or stances. But what we can see from the data is that there is a positive correlation between the perception of corruption and migration intentions. And this is both before and after the revolution. So we can see here in 2009 that the group that intends to migrate, that answered yes on the question if they intend to migrate, have a higher perception of corruption when it comes to witnessing bribery or nepotism than the group that does not want to migrate. And the same pattern we can also see in 2013 and 2004. And however, not as intense as before. However, the correlation is there, that the perception of corruption plays a role in the migration intentions, or is positively correlated with that, which means that the optimism channel could be driving the results. Looking at the economic channel, this is something that is not measured by the difference estimation that we conduct, because it's not a direct effect of the revolution on the migration intentions, but rather an indirect effect through employment, the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, and other macroeconomic factors. Also, there is no clear direct geographical variation when it comes to the perception of economic hardship, or the perception of economic difficulties that arise after a revolution. To conclude, the slum youth in Egypt exhibit different perceptions of the revolution effects than the urban or the rural sample, and the optimism channel seems to be the one driving the migration intentions of the slum population after the revolution, not per se the insecurity channel. And we, of course, assume that this optimism channel has diminishing effects per time. The survey questions, the panel data that we used stopped at 2014, which means, of course, the optimism channel years after would look differently, or perhaps be less intense. As I'm not sure if I'm out of time. There's a bit of robustness checks and attrition model that we do that I'd be happy to share now, or in the discussion if it arises, depending on time availability.
Thank you, Reem. Perhaps you can share that later if there are some questions. Sure. Yeah, okay, so that we can have enough time for discussion as well. So let me very quickly also share my discussion comments with you, and then we will open the discussion to the floor. So the first paper by Shireen, so let me just not summarize them because we just heard about it. Basically, the question is who can work from home in MENA? And as Shireen also explained, she's only looking at one side of this issue, which is the supply side and not the demand side. And we know that there has been obviously a big decline in aggregate demand, which is also destroying a lot of jobs. But she's basically focusing on the supply side. And she's using this data from ONET, from the US Department of Labor, and a number of surveys from the MENA region. So she has put a lot of work in putting together all this data and matching the occupations, which is really painful, I can imagine. So the results are basically expected stuff, I suppose, that the most disadvantaged workers are the ones who are going to be most hardly hit by the pandemic as well. So obviously this is a very timely paper. All of us are struggling with, even those of us who are lucky enough to work from home, we're still struggling with, managing work and home at the same time. But we understand that life is even more difficult for some others. So my main concern in regards to this very interesting paper was in regards to the contribution to the literature in terms of the index. I wasn't exactly sure, perhaps this can be clarified in the paper a little bit more. There's a paper that Shireen follows, Dingell and Nyman's paper, but is there anything else that she does new? I'm not so sure about. So perhaps this is something that can be clarified. But my other concern was in regards to mapping. So she's going from a 6-digit standard occupational classification that the US uses, because that's the information that we have, to a 2-digit in the international standard classification of occupations, which we use in this part of the world. So basically, you are reducing the data from a 6-digit to a 2-digit type of an information. And I would imagine that a lot of information is lost when you do this, because you do a lot of aggregation, obviously, and averaging out, and which washes out a lot of detail. So that's one of my questions. Shireen also mentioned this in her presentation, but it wasn't very clear in the paper perhaps. And I was wondering whether if a job can be done remotely in the United States, is it really the case in this part of the world as well? So that was another question that I would have. Though Shade carries out a robustness check by looking at the Egyptian labor market panel survey, there are so many, the results are so very different when she uses different criteria that I'm not so sure how useful this exercise is, basically. I mean, that's what I had a question in my mind. But there's, in Algeria, so technically speaking, for occupations, the international classification is 4 digits, right? I mean, I suppose in the data that Shireen has, she only has 2-digit data, and this is the reason why she does this. She needs to do this aggregation. But Algeria has 3-digit classification. So I was wondering whether Algeria can be reduced to 2-digit first, do the matching, just as we have done for Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan, and see the sensitivity of, instead of using 3 digits or a 4-digit we can't do, but we can compare, I suppose, for Algeria, going from a 3-digit classification to a 2-digit classification, what happens to the results, how sensitive our results are to this aggregation problem. So obviously, I mean, we've just seen the results that Shireen is a very positive person, so she interprets these as something positive. The numbers are, of course, very low. But I was also wondering, so I'm not familiar with this teleworkability index, but if it was done pre-COVID, or is it really the case that after the COVID? So when we apply, so previously, this is what we thought were the occupations that could be done remotely. After COVID, what happened? What is the applicability of this index that has been developed by the 2 authors that we mentioned before? So is it possible to sort of compare for the United States pre and post, just to see what has changed, whether in terms of conceptualizing these occupations as it concerns, whether it can be, the work can be done remotely or not. Analysis, although this is a continuous, I suppose, a variable, teleworking variable, it's converted to a dichotomous variable and then analyzed as a probit. So I was wondering why this is done. It's because it further reduces, of course, the variation in the data. So why not do, use it as a continuous variable? But I really enjoy reading it, so thank you very much. This second paper, I'll just really quickly go to Reem's paper. So again, let me not just do the aim, but just mention that this is a panel data that they're using on survey on young people in Egypt, and only for 2 time periods. So the main challenge here is that you want to use this differences methodology, which really relies on this parallel trend assumption. But because you only have 2 points, 2 years of data, it's not possible to test whether or not this parallel trend assumption holds. I think this is an important drawback, because unless we see that, obviously, how do we know whether or not this method is applicable for our case? So they regrouped the data, the respondents, into a control group and treatment group based on this index, which is called revolution intensity measure. And if it's below the median, then you're a control group. If you're above the median, you're in treatment group. But we never see the distribution of this revolution intensity measure, which is extremely important because everything depends on this index, really. So, I mean, I would have liked to see some more work done on this index to convince us, where do you draw the line? What happens if you, redefine this index a little differently, or choose a different cutoff value. The results, stronger effects for young men, women in informal slum areas, and then the channel is, they interpret as a pull factor, the optimism channel. Now, in terms of the data, because they use this panel data, although Reem did not have, she did not have enough time to explain us this attrition, but I think that's an important issue in this case, for the reason that when you follow the descriptive stats, if I'm not incorrect, then you see a big drops in the observation numbers. So this sort of raises concern that perhaps this attrition, which naturally happens in panel data, I mean, it's unavoidable. But I think what we need to be convinced about is that this attrition is random and it's not because of some systematic difference among the respondents. And then, of course, the main dependent variables is migration intention. And then when you look at the number of individuals who answered this question, it's also much lower. So the number of observations for different parts are different. So I wasn't exactly sure why there are different number of observations in different parts. And then in 2014, that number increases. So I was a little confused about why would a number increase. It should decline because of attrition, but should not be increasing. And this is my point about the parallel trends assumption, which is not tested, and it's problematic. And also, it's quite interesting that it's the educated youth living in slum areas that change their migration intentions, but not the educated youth in urban and rural areas. The explanation is convincing to me, but nonetheless, I was wondering whether perhaps a small number of educated youth in these areas, they are the ones that are driving these results. And also the other point, when Reem was explaining during the presentation just now, I realized that in fact, some of the coefficients that are not significant, for instance, for the low educated, in fact, the coefficients are quite large, but they're imprecisely estimated. So I think that needs to be paid attention to, because the number of observations was rather low as well. So it's not that perhaps it's not significant. Well, it's not statistically significant, I can see that, but the size of the coefficient was quite large, in fact. So I think it needs to be carefully thought about again. And the mean values given perhaps at the table, so that we can judge how big the magnitudes are with respect to the mean values, which are not given. So 13.5 percentage point from where, right? So, and the other thing is, I think I'm also talking too much, perhaps I should stop. Perhaps give something more information about the slum areas. Slum, I thought about, close to the urban areas, access to the labor market is better as compared to rural areas. So it will be good to give some more explanation. So let me stop here. I don't want to take too much time, because obviously we might have also questions from the floor. So let me turn to the floor. You can ask your questions through this Q&A button, or you can raise your hand and I will hopefully see you. And then we will have your microphone turned on, so you can also, if you wish, ask your questions. Any questions, anyone? You can raise your hand and we will turn on your microphone. Or you can write in the chat or the Q&A. So I'm basically looking at both places to see whether you can see that. But in the meantime, if there are no questions, let me turn to Shirin and Reem if they would like to add anything while we wait for questions. Shirin, would you like to go first?
Yes, sure. I just want to reply to a few of the very nice comments that you made. Thank you very much for taking the time to read the paper and giving me this useful feedback. So your question about how many jobs actually were done from home in the United States, for which we have better data. Nicholas Bloom of Stanford estimated that about 44% of jobs nationwide Of course, it varies a lot by country, by county or by region. Like in San Francisco Bay Area where I live, for example, all jobs were done from home essentially, since everyone works in high tech. But in rural Alabama, things were very different. So it's close to the estimate of Dingle and Neiman. The question about the concordances, it was a nightmare, as you predicted, especially that there's not very good documentation actually for any of the surveys, unfortunately. So sometimes it says it's ISCO 88 when it's actually ISCO 2008. So it was quite a challenge. I did do it for Jordan at the 4-digit ISCO level as a robustness check. And the number that I found at the 2-digit was 29%. At the 4-digit, it was 31%. So slightly higher. So I do expect, yes, if I was able to do it at the 4 or even 6-digit for all of the countries, things would have been a bit different. I didn't do the Algeria thing, but maybe I could do it. The 6-digit ISCO classification was from the ELMPS. So the Egypt ELMPS data does provide the 6-digit ISCO classification. It's actually CAPMAS's own classification system. And that is what I used to decide whether a job can be performed from home based on the survey questions. And then I sort of reduced it to the 2-digit to merge it with the data from Palestine and Jordan, and the 3-digit for Algeria. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the model. I tried both. I tried the continuous version and the binary variable. The coefficients were not that different in terms of either of the implication. So being a male youth still resulted in lower teleworkability. I just presented those in the paper. I guess I could present both. There is no overarching reason except that the other papers in the literature did the binary variable. So that I just want to stop here to give Reem some time to respond as well. Thank you very much.
I will just unmute myself. Thank you very much for your feedback. The feedback is really something that I think we need to work on. It's definitely something I can already know where the problems lie. First thing I want to clarify is the differences between the survey of young people in Egypt, or the site, or and the harmonized survey of young people in Egypt. So both of them. So the survey of young people was conducted in 2009 and surveyed 15,000 people, and then after the data in 2014 was collected, naturally, like 4,000 people. A bit more than 4,000 people were dropped. And then the remaining 10,900 something made the harmonized survey of young people. So this is why we we see a difference in the total number of people that answered certain questions. And the travel intentions are one of them, where we can unfortunately see that there are some people who said that they intend to migrate in 2009 that were not reached out to again in 2014, were not really found again in the methods, in the available methods. So this is why the sample drops between the harmonized and the survey of young people in Egypt. But we for example, the attrition model, or for some robustness checks, we try to use the survey with the 15,000 people. So we have a bit more of a population of the sample size there. About the attrition model, I realized that so we only have the descriptive statistics where we compare demographics and of course travel intentions of the harmonized sample and the not harmonized sample, and we use it kind of to assume that the overall characteristics are the same. For both of them. It's of course not an extensive attrition model, but this is the one that we have, and we'll give it a bit more thought into how to prove it in a more quantitative way. So about the revolution intensity, if we have a bit of time and no one has questions, I can actually share a bit of the distribution or a bit of more information of how we calculated that. Just 1 second. I will show this table. So this table is in the paper, but I did not include it in the presentation. Here. So we had a bit of problems with calculating the revolution intensities, especially that during that time period, there were 4 governorates that were merged into 2 governorates. So, for example, we have here Helwan, where you can see there's no standard deviation, because for Helwan we conducted the revolution intensity per governorate because it did not exist when the survey was being made. The same goes to 6th of October. So we have here the mean of the revolution intensity per governorate. We also have the total number of respondents that live in that governorate. And of course, the minimum and maximum revolution intensity per district within that government. So, I mean, we can clearly see that there are a few governorates that are kind of driving the results or have the highest revolution intensity. But this is why we made sure that the treatment and control group are actually separated at the governorate level, not overall in Egypt, because then there will be other effects, of course, selection effects.
We're, I think, out of time. So if you can just wrap up and then...
Sure.
I'm looking at if I see any other questions, but there are no other questions. But please go ahead and wrap it up so that we can say goodbye, because perhaps there's another session coming up. So.
Sure. No, I just wanted to thank you for the feedback, and of course this opportunity to be able to share our work here in this conference, and I appreciate the feedback greatly.
Thank you so much. Sorry that we have to rush a little bit, but 1 hour is really quite, it just flies by, I suppose. But thank you very much for everyone who participated. 2 very good, very interesting papers, very timely papers. So we thank everyone, especially the presenters, of course, for their very good work. So hopefully we shall see each other in other sessions. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.